In this video, I'm going to show you how to shoot things in Blender. I'm going to teach you some very simple techniques that I use to make muzzle flashes, tracers, bullet impacts, lasers, sparks, debris, destruction, and other effects right in Blender without any compositing. You can use these techniques in both Cycles and Eevee, and they require no fluid simulations, are very performance friendly, and are fast to set up. I know that there are many tutorials out there that already cover stuff like this, but I thought, why not combine all of those great tutorials into a short, concise video for your convenience? Like my other videos, this is going to be fast-paced. This isn't for beginners. If you want to skip to a certain section of the video, there are timestamps in the description. First, let's cover some super easy and flashy stuff. Muzzle flashes. Specifically procedural muzzle flashes. Full disclosure, I have to give full credit to Pierrick from P2 Design for this. If you want a full, in-depth 20-minute tutorial on exactly how each node works for this shader, you should watch his video on muzzle flashes. Essentially, the muzzle flashes are a bunch of perpendicular planes with shaders on them. There are two shaders, one for the front of the muzzle flash for viewing it head-on, and the other one for the long flames. We'll call them the muzzle front and muzzle side shaders. To start, let's create a plane and rotate it 90 degrees. Then, we'll create a new material for our muzzle front shader. We'll start with a texture coordinate node and a mapping node with a UV plugged into the vector. Make sure that the mapping type is set to texture. Now we'll add in a gradient texture set to quadratic sphere. This will create a circular gradient on our plane, which we will center by changing the coordinates of the mapping node to 0.5 for x and y. Then, we'll add in a color ramp node to tighten the gradient so that it fits within the plane. To distort the circular gradient into a muzzle flash shape, we need to add some noise. We'll add in another mapping node with the UV plugged into the vector. Then we'll add a noise texture. Again, make sure that the mapping type in the mapping node is set to texture. We'll set the noise type to 4D, and then add a color ramp for some control. With Node Wrangler, we can Control-Shift-click on the color ramp node to see our noise texture and play around with how it looks. By mixing our two color ramps together with a mixed color node, you can start to see how we will form the muzzle flash shape. To make the noise texture streak from the center, let's change the location of the second mapping node to 0.5 for x and y. Then, we'll add in a map range node before the mapping node, and connect the gradient texture color to the map range value, then the map range results to the scale input of the mapping node. If you play with the values to the 2min input, then we can start creating the streaking effect for our muzzle flash. Play with the values, color ramps, and mix factor until the white parts start resembling a starry muzzle flash shape. To isolate the white part of our shader, let's create a mixed shader node and plug in the mixed color result into the factor input. We'll add in a transparent BSDF shader for the first shader input and an emission shader for the second shader input. For more control, we'll add in another color ramp node between the mixed color node and the mixed shader node. By adjusting the color ramp, we can increase the contrast until the muzzle flash isn't cropped by the edges of the plane. Finally, to add in some color, we're going to add in a final color ramp node connected to the result of the mixed color node, and then plug it into the color input for the emission shader. I put 3 colors into the color ramp, red on the left side, white on the right side, and then orange in the middle. The basic shader setup is now done. It's now up to you to tweak the values to achieve the look that you want. I adjusted my map range node to get my muzzle flash to be more streaky. Finally, if you want, you can add a driver to the W value of the noise texture node to make it so that the noise texture changes every frame. And that's the muzzle front shader done. I'm going to leave a picture of the full node tree for 5 seconds so that you can copy it if you need to. I don't know why no one else does this in their tutorials. The process for the muzzle side shader is pretty similar to the muzzle front shader. We're going to start off with a texture coordinate node and then connect the UV to a separate XYZ node to isolate the Y coordinates. Then we're going to make 2 color ramps that are connected to the Y output of the separate XYZ, and then plug them into a combined XYZ node with one ramp going to the X input and one ramp going to the Y input. Now we're going to make a mapping node. Make sure the type is set to texture. Then we're going to connect the combined XYZ output into the scale and connect the UV output from the texture coordinate node into the vector input. Connect the mapping node to a noise texture node. To center the texture onto the plane in the mapping node, set the location X and Y to 0.5. Now, similar to the muzzle front material, to crop the noise texture so that it doesn't reach the edge of the plane, we need to add a gradient node. To do this, we will duplicate all the nodes between the texture coordinate node and the noise texture node, and plug back in all the relevant inputs. Now we can add a gradient texture set to quadratic sphere. To add another level of control, we can add in color ramps after the gradient texture and the noise texture nodes. Now the process becomes almost identical to the other Muzzle Flash shader. We will add a mixed color node to combine the noise and gradient texture, and then we'll add another color ramp for more control. Again, like the previous shader, play around with the color ramps and the noise texture settings to dial in the look of the flames. We'll add in a second color ramp for the emission color, and then finish up the shader by adding in a mixed shader node connected to a transparency and emission shader with the first color ramp connected to the factor. Of course, the second color ramp goes into our emission shader, and I'll set up the colors to whatever I want. From here, play around with all the ramps and values of different nodes until you get the flames looking decent. Keep in mind that this texture will be stretched out later since those flames will be longer. Again, I'm going to put the node tree on the screen for 5 seconds for your convenience. Now, let's assemble the Muzzle Flash. Let's start off with a plane rotated 90 degrees on the x-axis. Then we'll duplicate the plane, extrude it into a cube, delete the front face, and then collapse the back face to a point. Make sure to UV unwrap it. Then we'll add another plane, rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis, and stretch it out on the y-axis. Now we'll assign the muzzle side shader to the long plane to see how much we need to adjust the plane. Finally, let's duplicate the long plane in edit mode and rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis, and then assign the muzzle front shaders to all the other planes. And now we're done. Feel free to keep tweaking the shaders to dial in the effect to your liking. To make it simpler to work with, you can either join all the planes together into one object, or you can throw it into a collection and instance it. I just joined the planes together into an object, and then I put the origin where the flash starts. For animations where you need very precise timing of the muzzle flash and you aren't dealing with too many in your scene, you can manually keyframe the render visibility and have it appear and disappear. Alternatively, you can just keyframe the scale of the muzzle flash and alternate the scale from 0 to 1. Regardless of how you show and hide the muzzle flash, keep in mind that in real life, muzzle flashes do not grow or shrink gradually. They appear for a split second, usually for a frame, and then disappear immediately, followed by a puff of smoke. However, if you want many muzzle flashes in your scene, or you don't need precise control over the timing of muzzle flashes, like in the case of a long burst of automatic fire, you can use a particle system instead. Simply make a plane, add a particle system, and set the number of particles equal to the amount of shots you want in a given time frame. The number of particles divided by the total amount of frames of the particle system will determine your rate of fire per frame. You can multiply this number by your frame rate to determine the rate of fire per second, and then multiply that by 60 to get the rounds per minute. After choosing a number of particles and setting the duration of our particle system, we'll set the render display to object and select our muzzle flash object. You can set the scale to your liking and whether you want the scale to be randomized. If we press play now, we'll notice that the particles will drop due to gravity. To prevent this, simply turn off gravity and the field weights, as well as everything else depending on what you have in your scene. Wind or turbulence will make the flashes go wonky as well. Finally, set the lifetime of the particles to 1 frame. Depending on the size of the muzzle flash particle, you'll need to reduce the size of the emitter plane until any jitter is unnoticeable. For more randomness and variation, you can set the rotation random phase to 1 to make each particle have a different rotation. Remember to bake your particle system once you've finalized everything to prevent other particle systems or physics that might accidentally affect the muzzle flashes in the future. You can attach these particle systems to the muzzle of guns by moving the flash emitter over to the desired area, then adding a child of constraint to the emitter, and then selecting the gun object or armature as the target. And that's how you can create muzzle flashes. These flashes look great in both Cycles and Eevee, and once you've made it, you can just append the flash object and emitters to any file that you want to use them in. Now that we have our muzzle flashes, it's time to add some bullets, which are visible as tracers. There are a few techniques to create the tracer effect, but the simplest way is to turn on motion blur in your render settings, and use a simple cube or icosphere with an emission shader and a particle system. To do this, let's start off by adding a new particle system to our already existing muzzle flash particle emitter. We're going to set the duration and number of particles to be the same or roughly similar to our muzzle flash particle system, and then set the velocity to a higher number depending on your shot. If you're doing a close-up shot, you want the velocity to be a bit lower to capture the flashes in frame. If you have a wider shot, you want the bullets to travel straighter, so you would want a higher velocity. If you want to add a bit of spread or randomness to the tracers, you can play with the object velocity and the randomized inputs. Once you're happy with your bullets, it's time to make them glow. To do this, simply create a cube and add a simple emission shader to it. You can scale it down, change its shape, and adjust the colors and brightness to your liking. Then, set the particle system type to object and select your cube. Adjust the scale to your liking and then you're done. It may not look good in the viewport, but if you render a few frames, they will appear as long, bright streaks. This is the simplest way to create tracers. However, you could take things even further and customize your tracer shape. Instead of using a cube, you could use a sphere or play around with shaders and create something new. So here's some examples that I've used in the past. Most of these are just cylinders or planes with custom shader setups. This one here is just two perpendicular planes with a very simple shader that makes one end fade and taper off into a nice tail. I'll leave the shader on the screen for a few seconds for you to copy. Here's a streakier tracer that I use for magic spells or arrows, which is just a simple noise texture shader mapped onto a cube with a bevel modifier. Again, here's the node tree for those who want to copy. This tracer is actually one that I used in this short, which is actually just the muzzle flash asset we created, but without the front-facing planes. So if you followed the muzzle flash tutorial, then you should know how to make this tracer. One thing that may stump beginners when playing with particles is particle orientation. If for some reason your tracer is facing the wrong direction, like it's coming out sideways, instead of mindlessly tweaking and checking the particle settings, the simplest way is to simply adjust the orientation of the tracer object manually by selecting the tracer object, going into edit mode, selecting everything and rotating it until it looks right in the particle system. All the tracers I've shown here are super simple, and you should experiment yourself with different shaders and shapes to create a tracer that suits your weapon or art style. Keep in mind that motion blur heavily affects how the tracer will appear in your render, and that different art styles of tracers sometimes could benefit from having no motion blur. Sometimes if the motion blur is too high, you might not see a difference between using a tracer with a custom shader versus just using a glowing cube. The choice of tracer and the amount of motion blur all depends on your scene. If you have a very chaotic scene and you want the motion blur to emphasize that, then you can get away with using cubes as your tracers. On the other hand, if you have a scene where you aren't using as much motion blur, maybe to draw emphasis to details or to make a shot appear less shaky, that's where you would use tracers with more detail. Alright, so now we have our muzzle flashes, we have our projectile tracers, and now we need the bullet impacts. Now bullet impacts are actually pretty simple to make. First, we'll start off with a simple single impact. Like the other effects in this video, we'll start off with a plane as our particle emitter. As for the particles themselves, let's start off by making some simple bits of debris. A quick and dirty way of making unique pieces of debris is to select the corners of a cube, press Ctrl B, and then press V to bevel the corner vertices. Another quick way to make bits of debris is to get a cube or any primitive solid and then right click in edit mode and click subdivide. In the subdivide settings, turn up the fractal amount. You can also play around with the number of cuts and other settings for more dynamic results. After we've made a few pieces of debris, we'll throw them into a collection so that we can reference them in the particle system. So now let's select our plane, create a particle system, and in the render tab, select collection and then reference our newly made collection. Now this part of the particle settings is all about trial and error. Depending on the effect that you want, you'll need to play around with different settings. But for a single impact, you don't want any more than a few hundred to a few thousand particles. And you want the duration of the particle system to be 1 frame for a single impact. The particle lifetime is up to you. The velocity settings are also pretty arbitrary, but I like to go for around 3 to 4 meters per second and set the object velocity above 0, and then randomize it by a factor of 3 for super chaotic directions. I usually also turn on dynamic rotations and randomize everything. For the physics, it's also up to you, but I like to add a bit of erratic movement by turning up the Brownian setting just a little bit. You can also create a floor plane and turn on collisions to make the particles fall on the ground. You can play around with the collision settings to get the particles to bounce or slide the way you want them to. If you're happy with what you have, you can stop here, but I often like to layer on multiple particle systems for my impacts. Here I'm making a cube with an emission shader to add some sparks. Then, I can either duplicate my existing particle system or create a new particle system on the same emitter plane, and then instead of rendering it as our debris collection, we can choose the spark as our render object. After this, you can play around with the settings, layer on even more particle systems, and you should end up with something like this at the end. In this particular example, I have 4 particle systems layered on top of each other. One for big chunks of debris, one for the sparks, one for the smaller debris, and a final one for the big sparks. Now what we have is good for most applications, but it could be better, especially if you want to focus on the impact. Looking at what we have, the most obvious thing that we're missing is the bullet hole and smoke. For the bullet hole, I usually just find a PBR texture online with good displacement, and stick it on a plane. Once you've downloaded the texture maps, a fast way to link them in Blender is to enable the Node Wrangler add-on, then press Ctrl-Shift-T on the Principled BSDF node, then selecting all the texture maps. Blender will automatically link them correctly and add in additional nodes if needed. After you've set up your material, you can apply it to a plane and then UV unwrap the plane and adjust the UVs until you get a nice single bullet hole. If you go into the material settings and switch the displacement setting to displacement and bump, you can subdivide the plane a bunch of times so that the geometry gets deformed. You can also play around with the displacement amount in the shader editor. To actually make a hole, I usually just Boolean difference a sphere out of the floor. You can quickly do this by selecting the floor, adding a Boolean modifier, and then selecting the sphere as the Boolean object. I'm using the HardOps add-on, so I can do this very quickly. To animate the bullet hole appearing, I literally just move both the bullet hole plane and the Boolean sphere underground, set a keyframe, move forward one keyframe, then raise them both up and set another keyframe. It's that simple. For the smoke, instead of using a smoke simulation or a VDB from online, I'll just use a video texture on a plane. You can find similar stock footage on websites like actionvfx.com. Once you have it downloaded, we can put it into Blender as a mesh plane. You can do this by enabling the built-in add-on Import Images as Planes. Once we have our video, we can reposition the plane to make the smoke align with our bullet impact. In the shader editor, you can specify the starting frame for the video in the Blender timeline, as well as the duration. The offset changes what frame the video starts. To get rid of the black background, we'll use the video as the factor in a mixed shader node, with the principal BSDF going into the second socket and a transparent shader going into the first socket. If your smoke appears really faded, you can add in a color ramp node in between the video texture and the mixed shader node and play around with the position of each end, as well as the colors. If you don't like the color of the smoke itself, you can replace the second socket in the mixed shader node with an emission shader or any other shader until you get the effect that you want. Mine looks okay with the principal BSDF. Once you've added the smoke and bullet holes, everything should look something like this. Now I know it could be fancier, but this is okay for most uses in both Cycles and Eevee. So far, everything I've just shown you is for a single bullet impact. If you have more than 3 bullet impacts, like in the case of machine gun fire, doing this over and over again will take ages because you need a unique particle system for each impact. So here's my quick and dirty method for multiple bullet impacts. Keep in mind that this technique won't include smoke or bullet holes. So here I have a new scene with a very similar setup to our single impact. I only have 2 particle systems on my emitter, the debris and the sparks, both set to go off on frame 1 and last for 1 frame. Since we're doing multiple impacts from a machine gun, I'm going to make the duration a bit longer, to let's say 100 frames. I'm also going to increase the particle count to compensate for the longer duration. This will take some trial and error. We'll do this for both particle systems that we have on the emitter, and we should end up with a fountain of particles. An important thing to note is that for this to work properly, you want to set the object velocities of the particle systems to 0. Now we'll turn on snapping, and make sure that we're snapping to faces. Make sure align rotation to target is turned off though. This will make it so that when we move our plane by pressing G, it'll snap to the floor. Scroll on the timeline to where your particle system begins, and press I to make a keyframe. Then, using the right arrow key, scroll 2 frames forward, move the emitter somewhere else on the floor, and then press I to set a keyframe. We're going to repeat this process a bunch of times, moving the plane to areas where you want to see impacts. The more random you make it, the better it looks in most cases. Once you've done it a bunch of times, we can duplicate some keyframes and slide them ahead in the timeline. If it feels too repetitive this way, you can even scale the keyframes by -1 to invert the animation. We'll continue to duplicate, scale, and slide over some more random keyframe segments until the end frame of the particle system, which in my case is frame 100. Then, we'll select all the keyframes, right-click, and then set the interpolation mode to constant, which will make the plane teleport to each location. Finally, we'll create an empty, and then parent the emitter plane to the empty by selecting the plane, then the empty, and then pressing Ctrl P, and then choosing Object Keep Transform. We'll turn off snapping now, and then shift the empty group slightly upwards to avoid the emitter plane getting stuck in the ground. Now you should have something like this. We can add even more impacts by just duplicating the empty and the emitter, and then repositioning the duplicated empty. You can also adjust and shift the keyframes of the duplicated emitter so that they aren't synchronized with the first emitter. If you're happy with what you have, after adding some tracers, the effect should look something like this. Now I know it seems a bit flat without the bullet holes, and the tracers sometimes don't line up with the impacts, but with dynamic scenes and movement, it's hard to notice, especially when there's a lot going on. Of course, you should always play around with the particle settings and the keyframes to get what you want. If the space between the keyframes are closer together, like 1 frame apart instead of 2 frames apart, then the movement will be more erratic, but then you'll have less particles per impact, so you have to increase the amount of particles. For focused bursts or lasers, you don't have to do the whole jittery, erratic movement thing. You can space out your keyframes more and set the interpolation mode to whatever fits your scene. In this example, I'm using linear interpolation because I want it to go from point A to point B at a constant rate. Which, as I said, is great for stuff like lasers. I'm using the exact same particle systems as before, but this time instead of teleporting them everywhere, I'm just moving it from point A to point B. While I'm on the topic, I'll quickly go over how to make lasers. In the example I just showed, the laser is literally just a cylinder with an emission shader. It doesn't have to be too fancy. and then it's as simple as moving the cylinder on the y-axis at a constant rate. To make the laser cut through the ground, I have a cube that the ground is Boolean differenced with that grows on the y-axis at the same rate that the laser is traveling. I do this by setting the origin to one of the cube's faces. That way it only scales in one direction. So this technique is pretty good for lasers that go in one direction or lasers that strafe. But what about more dynamic interactions, or making the laser follow a certain path, stick on and track objects, or follow your mouse cursor? To do this, we'll make a simple laser rig. We'll start off by making a cylinder, or whatever profile you want your laser to be. Then make a single bone. I'm going to position the ends of the bone to match the length of the cylinder. You can press Shift S to bring up the selection menu to make it easy to position the head and tail of the bone exactly where you want them. Afterwards, I'm going to create an empty plane axis at the tail, or the tip, of the bone. Then, I'm going to skin the cylinder to the bone by selecting the cylinder, then the bone, then pressing Ctrl P and selecting Armature Deform. It doesn't really matter which option you choose. In pose mode, accessed by selecting the bone and then pressing Ctrl Tab, I'm going to add the Stretch to Bone constraint to the bone. I'm going to choose the empty as the target. I'm also going to select None for maintain volume in the settings. Finally, I'm going to select the cylinder, go to the Object Data tab, go into Edit mode, and select everything by pressing A and assign it all to the existing vertex group. Now if I select the empty and move it around, the cylinder will follow, reorient, and stretch itself to the empty. If I want to change the starting point of the laser, I can just move the bone. Now if you set the snapping mode to faces and turn on snapping, you can have the laser follow your cursor by moving the empty. If you put a child of constraint on the empty and set the parent to an object, you can have the laser track an object. Then you just parent the spark emitter you made earlier to the empty, and now you have a dynamic laser. You can now keyframe the position of the empty to make it move dynamically or create the illusion of something blocking the laser. But what if you want to destroy something with the laser, like in this clip? The quickest way to destroy something is by using the self-fracture add-on and rigid bodies. Now I know that there are hundreds of tutorials on how to do this technique all over YouTube, but I thought might as well end the tutorial with the last effect used in the duck video. To get started, let's start off with a cube and a plane. For the plane, I turned on rigid body physics and checked the animated box. In the add-ons tab, make sure to enable the self-fracture add-on, which should be included in Blender by default, but has to be manually activated. To begin fracturing the cube, we first need enough geometry to fracture, so in edit mode, I'll subdivide the cube a bunch of times. Then, to initiate the self-fracture, I'll go to Object, Quick Effects, and choose Self-Fracture. You can play around with the self-fracture settings to get the effect you want for specific materials, but the default self-fracture settings work fine for this cube. To keep things organized, I'm going to put all these self-fracture fragments into their own collection. Then, to add rigid body physics to all the fragments, with all the fragments selected, I'm going to go to Object, Rigid Body, and choose Add Active. You can check to see if it worked by selecting random fragments and seeing if they have rigid body physics enabled. You can also just press play and see if it crumbles to the ground like this. Alright, so we have a crumbling cube, but what if we want the cube to crumble at a specific point on the timeline? To do that, we have to keyframe the animated checkbox in the rigid body physics settings. If it's checked, the object will not respond to physics. If it's unchecked, it'll act like an active rigid body. With that in mind, all we need to do is keyframe a frame with the animated checkbox checked, then find a point on the timeline after, when we want it to crumble, uncheck it, and add another keyframe. Once you're done with keyframing, with all the fragments selected, press Ctrl L and select Link Animation Data to copy over the keyframes to all the other fragments. In my case, I have the animated checkbox checked on frame 40 and unchecked on frame 41, so on frame 41 the cube will crumble. Now at this point you may realize that before the cube has crumbled, you can still see the fracture lines and the seams between the fragments. If you notice though, the self-fracture operation did not delete the original cube. So what I usually do is I just scale up the original cube by a tiny amount to hide the fragments, and then I make it disappear on the frame that I want the cube to crumble. So now we have a cube that just crumbles into fragments. But if you want an explosion, we need to add some forces. By pressing Shift A and going into the Force Field tab, you can find a variety of different force effectors. The most common one is just a regular point-like force, which either attracts or repels things. By setting the force strength high enough, you can make the fragments go flying. Just remember that this force is constant, so it will continuously apply the force every frame. If you want to simulate the shockwave of an explosion, you can keyframe the strength of the force by pressing I while hovering over it, or by clicking the dot next to the text box. To get consistent results, remember to go to the Scene tab and bake your simulation every time you change something about the rigid body physics. Now just add back in the laser and sparks, keyframe the emission strength on the materials, and you get this. Of course, you can apply this exact same technique on a larger scale to create more complex destruction. Here, I made a building out of some cubes and applied the same cell fracture and rigid body operations to each of the parts. I quickly made this scene without changing any of the default rigid body or cell fracture settings, which is why the chunks look a bit basic and a bit too big. The end result isn't bad, but with more fine-tuning and tweaking, it could look really realistic. If you want more in-depth tutorials on this stuff, I put a few good destruction tutorials in the description. So far in this one video, I've covered muzzle flashes, projectile tracers, single impacts, multi-impacts, sparks, lasers, and rigid body destruction. All of the techniques I've shown require no third-party add-ons or any work done outside of Blender. For things like muzzle flashes, tracers, and impacts, once you've made them, you can copy them to any project file you need them in. So now you'll have your own collection of quick special effects. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. I'm sorry that this took like 9 months to make. I was busy with my final year of my master's program, and after that I have job applications to worry about. But now that I'm done with university for good, I'll probably have more time to make videos in the future. So please like and subscribe if you find my tutorials useful, and leave suggestions for what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.